Christmas Eve surprise. It was time to celebrate Christmas. Three loyal friends, three women in the prime of their lives, Ellen, Betty, and Laurie, thought they had planned all the details of the holiday and calculated all the options of who would return to their home, how, and when. It began when Ellen suddenly suggested that they celebrate Christmas at her cottage, where she lived with her not only favorite man, but also her childhood friend, Benjamin, or just Ben. Betty, along with all her many relatives on her husband's side, architect Bjorn, his children and grandchildren, as well as their mutual pet Labrador dog Brock, had at first rejected the idea of combining this Christmas with a visit to Ellen's house. But then she changed her mind, and after firmly informing her family that they would spend Christmas at her best friend's house, she shopped for groceries to make her favorite cherry pies, which she had canned for the occasion during the summer. Laurie, renting a guest house from Ellen, would keep everything in her plans the same. Her children, daughters Anna and Katya, were in college far away, and we were not going to visit their parents this Christmas. And her husband, Daniel, was at odds with her. Laurie was, frankly, on the verge of divorcing her husband. Ellen offered to spend Christmas at her house so that Laurie could feel the warmth of the friendship that had long bound the three women together. Ellen tended to the house, tidying it up. Ben did not interfere with her friends' preparations for the holiday and the reception. However, he had his own business. He had to finish the case of a client of his law practice, and it took up all his free time. The work of a lawyer did not involve too much free time. Still, it brought a good enough income for him and Ellen to live in this luxurious cottage on the shore of the lake. Ellen had plenty of money of her own, though, for, despite her ex-husband's scheming in the divorce, she still received half the value of the business she and he had founded decades ago. Ellen quickly glanced out the window at the lake. The water surface had already been covered in a film of first ice for days. And then, just before Christmas, it suddenly sprinkled thick snow. The shore opposite the lake was entirely out of sight in the snowstorm's shroud. Well, this is the last thing we need, Ellen thought, and quickly saw if her husband had brought enough chopped wood into the house for the fireplace. She also went to the room where she kept her winter food supplies and checked to ensure there were candles and matches on the shelf at the very top of the shelf. Ellen knew that if it snowed like this, she could expect the power to be out for quite a while, although no one ran to work on Christmas Day to repair power lines that had been broken or fallen by heavy snow. But that snowball outside the window wasn't scary yet. All Ellen had done was simply get used to many surprises. The front doorbell rang, and the voices of Youth and Betty were heard behind it. Ellen, smiling contentedly, walked to the hallway and opened the door for her guests. Betty, her husband, his grown children, Helen and Bobby, and the little grandchildren, Alexa and Sergo, piled into the hallway. Betty immediately, before she could even hug her friend, handed her a tray of pies carefully wrapped in a kitchen towel. They smelled so fragrant, even through the careful wrapping, that Ellen closed her eyes briefly, inhaling it and enjoying the cozy smell. While Ellen and Betty exchanged greetings, Bjorn helped his daughter remove her grandchildren's outerwear and hang them on the coat rack in the hallway. Finally, everyone hugged each other, kissed each other on the cheeks, and walked from the hallway into the living room. And there they discovered an incredible beauty. The Christmas tree, beautifully decorated with handmade toys and the garland of colorful lights, proudly raised its top almost 3 meters up, almost to the very ceiling of the living room of the cottage. Beautifully wrapped presents were stacked under the tree. The wood burning in the fireplace crackled cozily in the room's corner. In the middle of the room was set a dining table whose beauty would have been the envy of the best glossy magazines in the country. Laurie sat at the table with her hands folded modestly on its edge. She seemed undecided whether to get up and go straight to greet the guests, or to wait until Betty had sorted out who would be seated where in the large living room. Seeing her indecision, Betty ran over to her friend and hugged her tightly. Laurie rose from her chair, hugged her tightly, and kissed Betty on the cheek. "So, how are you doing?" concerned Betty asked. "I'm fine, just writing my book," Laurie calmly replied. She had nothing more to add, they were just drafting her book. Her typewriter clattered away in the guest house from morning to night. Ellen didn't bother her friend and waited until Laurie left the cabin, usually in the evening, to take a little walk along the lake shore and perhaps talk to Ellen. Her friends could see Laurie was lonely, working on her next book, sitting listlessly in the guest house she rented from Ellen. But the woman was not giving up. She had to finish her story and turn it into her literary agent, Matt, whom she couldn't stand. That's what Laurie had told everyone. But somehow, Ellen did not believe her. Laurie, who was usually reserved in expressing her feelings, was indignant about how much fun he had when she, in his opinion, made blunders or hesitated to do something important for her books. However, Ellen needed to understand why Laurie would not change her literary agent. After all, no one would mock Laurie, and she would not have to waste precious time going on about how annoying he was to her, this Matt. Something is not right here, as Laurie wants to show, thought Ellen, intrigued by the situation. She could not understand Laurie's motives for such contradictory behavior. However, Ellen did not believe it was possible to ask her friend directly about the reasons for this behavior. So the reasons for Laurie's pronounced intolerance or, on the contrary, for her strange affection for her literary agent, Matt, remained unclear for the time being. In inviting all her friends to Christmas dinner, Ellen had planned a surprise that would make Laurie's feelings and desires clearer. Betty had also long been intrigued by Laurie's feedback about her agent and had joined Ellen's plan. She was also curious to know about a man who could irritate Laurie. After all, Laurie had lived with her husband, who had a challenging temperament, for decades. So this Matt of hers had brought something into their friend's life that she hadn't expected. So, the friends provoked Laurie, hoping they wouldn't cross the line. When all the guests settled in their seats at the festive table, one of them noticed that one chair was still unoccupied and asked, "Are we expecting anyone else?" Betty, bouncing her fist with barely restrained laughter, replied, "Apparently, this place is for Brock." The dog, hearing his name, immediately emerged from under the table with a puff of laughter and stared at his mistress with joyous anticipation. But Betty patted him affectionately on the neck and gestured for him to lie back under the table, which he did. The guests' attention shifted to the treats that Ellen brought to the table. As if out of thin air, various appetizers magically appeared on the table. Red salmon caviar, smoked salmon, cut into thin slices. Eggplants fried in oil and garlic were laid out separately. There were many other things as delicious as these New Year's appetizers. Burning candles in a branching antique candlestick, which Betty had helped the hostess to bring and place on the table, gave the entire picture of holiday abundance a cozy and somewhat mysterious look. When the guests, praising the food served to them, finished sampling the hors d'oeuvre, Ellen announced a brief break to serve the main course, a turkey baked in the oven stuffed with prunes and fresh apples. At that moment, there was a knock on the cottage door. Everyone looked around, not realizing who else had come to this feast, where only 3 families who knew each other well were gathered. Ellen, quickly removing her apron, crumpled it up and tossed it on the sofa. Laurie noticed this, for the usually neat and judicious Ellen was now doing something unusual for her. But since Ben, Ellen's husband, was not disturbed by his wife's somewhat agitated behavior and continued his conversation with Betty's husband's children, Laurie was distracted from where Ellen had gone, thinking it was just some mail carrier bringing a late gift from distant relatives. Finally, Ellen returned to the living room. And then everyone froze. Standing next to her was the genuine Santa. He was solidly built, with thick straw-colored eyebrows that did not need wide absorbent cotton to make him look like a real fairy Santa. The beard was white, though, and hid most of Santa's face. He stood next to Ellen, and his radiant blue eyes hid in the wrinkles of a smile that was impossible to look away from. Santa was dressed in a traditionally red suit, the edges of his garment fringed with fluffy white faux fur. The caftan was girded with a thick twisted rope with gold and silver threads woven into it. Over Santa's shoulder was slung a sack made of coarse hemp cloth, clearly something bulky. The little children squealed with delight and rushed towards Santa. Older children also scrambled out of their seats and approached the fantastic guest. Santa, still grinning, said, "Ho ho ho ho. Okay, here come my words. Guess what I brought you all?" The little ones, trying to outshout one another, shouted out, "Presents! Santa has brought us presents." Indeed, Santa took the sack off his shoulder with feigned effort, dropped it to the floor beside him, and, slowly untying it, asked the children what they would like for Christmas. Laurie watched the spectacle like a mesmerized child. She had long since forgotten what it was like to celebrate Christmas with young children. Her children went to school and lived far away from her and Daniel. In recent years, Christmas gatherings together have become rarer and rarer. Laurie had yet to count on having grandchildren in the next few years. That is why she took these years and used them to fulfill her dream and publish her books. When the presents from Santa's sack were distributed to the children, he straightened up and stared at Laurie. She did not understand at first what he wanted from her. But then Santa gently gestured for the surrounding children to step aside and said, "Now I have one gift for the grown-ups. But it's only one, and I know who gets it." Laurie stared at Santa unwaveringly. She felt she knew the low, husky voice and how he spoke. But the person she thought of was her literary agent, Matt, whom she hadn't seen or called in a couple of months, would never show up at her friend's house for Christmas. And Laurie dismissed her suspicions. Meanwhile, Santa pulled a rather large box out of his sack, about the size of a duffel bag. The box was colorfully wrapped and tied with a pink satin ribbon. He took the box and stepped toward the table. Ellen, who still hadn't moved from her seat, rushed to the table and pushed aside some appetizer plates to make room for the box. Santa carefully placed the box on the table and, looking directly into Laurie's eyes, said, "Well, here you go, Loretta, this is Santa's present for you." Laurie sat, stunned and intrigued. Of course, she realized it was Ellen and Betty who had arranged something for her, but her humble gifts they had graciously accepted by simply placing them under the tree. They were going to open them after Christmas came. So why should she have to present a gift like this, all at once, in front of everyone? Laurie stood up, embarrassed by the looks of her friends, and timidly walked around the table and approached Santa. He nodded approvingly, suggesting that she open the gift now. Laurie rustled the wrapping unhesitatingly, removing the ribbon and wrapping it from the box. Suddenly she shrieked with surprise and joy. She was holding a laptop computer of the best brand. Laurie twirled her present, not knowing how to unwrap the gift further. Santa came to her aid. He took off his white gloves, and with strong fingers, he tore the sticky tape that attached the edges of the box to each other, and nuzzled the open box towards Laurie. Laurie hesitantly placed her palms on the lid of the laptop and tapped it. A dark screen stared back at her, and in front of it was a dark keyboard with a protective film. Laurie carefully removed the protective film from the keyboard and pressed the start button. The laptop screen flashed, and rainbow circles ran across it. This device had a battery charge, allowing it to be used immediately. That's when Laurie broke the silence. I don't know what to say. This whole thing exceeds my ability to think rationally. Who is this gift from?" She ogled her friends testily. But the party guests huddled around her only smiled and looked at each other conspiratorially. Then Betty leaned forward a little from the crowd and said, "Laurie, this is a present from all of us. You realize it's very expensive. No one could have bought it personally from themselves. But all of us are together. We are the power." Laurie, almost with tears in her eyes, nodded gratefully, looking around at her friends. Thank you," she whispered, stroking the keyboard with her slender fingers, but not pressing the keys. Santa, standing next to her, said in a thick voice, "Well, now for some more magic." He pulled out of his kaftan pocket a computer mouse pad, and wipes to wipe the screen. These he placed on the table next to the laptop. Laurie looked at her presents, not believing her eyes. Her friends had made sure that she would continue to work on her manuscripts and use a state-of-the-art laptop instead of an old typewriter, where the ink ribbon was always drying up. They were a marvel. Laurie wiped away her tears and whispered, "I don't know how to thank you all. I really can't buy anything like this on my own yet. Thank you so much." She jumped up from her seat and rushed to hug Ellen, Betty, their husbands, and all the other guests that evening. Santa stood back with arms folded across his chest, watching the scene with clear pleasure. Suddenly, the lights went out, and all left was the illumination of the rays of the multicolored Christmas tree garland. A mysterious atmosphere prevailed in the living room. People murmured among themselves, gradually settling into their seats at the festive table. Laurie went to her seat, but suddenly, she noticed Santa still standing modestly to the side. She walked over and stopped before him, looking at his face, almost hidden by the semi-darkness. "I don't know how to thank you. Thank you for bringing this gift. It is precious to me." Just then, Santa leaned slightly toward her and whispered in her ear, "You can kiss me as well as your friends, I won't have anything against it." You could hear the irony in his voice, and some tenderness. The warmth of his breath reminded her she was here all alone, without her husband, with whom she was breaking up, and without her grown children. And Laurie was suddenly so desperate for warmth and affection, as if now only she realized how lonely she was. Laurie, all her senses heightened to the extreme, smiled embarrassedly and shook her head negatively. In return, she touched Santa's forearm lightly with her hand in gratitude. The man moved slightly toward her and suddenly put his arm around her shoulders gently, as if she were a girl lost in a crowd of strangers. His arms formed a circle from which Laurie had no strength to escape. She stepped even closer to Santa, not knowing why she was suddenly so drawn to this strange man. Perhaps it was the months of living alone, almost involuntary confinement, without the caress and embrace of a loved one. Santa hugged Laurie tighter, and they stood like that by the Christmas tree. He gently stroked Laurie's hair and shoulders, breathing in the scent of her hair. Laurie pressed her face against his kaftan, which smelled of Christmas tree resin and pine needles, and some expensive male perfume. Laurie wanted to feel someone's shoulder beside her, protection, and someone to whom she could give her unspent tenderness. So they stood embraced, and nothing prevented them from feeling as if the surrounding people, this room, and the darkness of the winter evening outside the cottage window simply did not exist. The scent of perfume suddenly stirred in Laurie's mind, an association that sent a shiver of indignation through her. Laurie sharply pushed Santa away and, still inside the circle of his arms, rested both hands on his chest, gazing intensely into his face, almost hidden by the white false beard. After a moment, her hunch was confirmed, and Laurie whispered angrily in a suppressed voice, "Enough. Stop this game." Santa hummed contentedly, shrugging his shoulders like a delinquent boy. But he let go of his hands, and Laurie took another step away. Then she took another step towards Santa and tugged sharply at his beard. The artificial beard slid down, and behind it revealed the smirking face of Matt, her hated and much-needed literary agent. The end. If you enjoyed this short Christmas story, you could read or listen to Laurie and Matt's entire love story in the novel named Love is Everything by Misha Quinn, with a release in 2024. Or if you want to know more about love stories of Ellen and Ben, Betty and Bjorn, then read all the books in the Sunset Lake Club series. All right reserved. Copyright by Misha Quinn, 2023.